Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd joined me a short time ago. Kevin Rudd, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Patricia.
What is your assessment of where these climate talks have landed?
I think on balance, having looked at the evolution of these sort of climate summits over the last decade, this one gets about an 8 out of 10. It's pretty good. It shows the Americans are back in the game. It shows they're providing global leadership. But more importantly, the Americans themselves have now committed to a further reduction in their own greenhouse gases by 2030 by a factor of some 50%. So that's putting your money where your mouth is. And many of its friends and partners and allies around the world are now lifting their effort, of course, except Australia. So on balance, I think a pretty good outcome for the planet so far.
Well, you mentioned Australia, or saying Australia wasn't lifting. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has been making the point that in order to achieve a reduction in emissions, you need to focus on the technology to get there rather than just timelines. What do you think about what he's contributed to this forum and the argument he's been making?
Well, what a nonsense argument. Of course technology is relevant to this. It's been relevant since we made our first commitments under the Kyoto Protocol way back when I was at Copenhagen, then again at Paris. I mean, technology is always part of the equation. But so more broadly are markets in terms of carbon markets, and then within those measures, they must all occur within a framework of a target to bring down overall greenhouse gas emissions. And that's driven by science and maths. Why do we talk about targets? It's pretty simple, Patricia. If we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists says we must keep average temperature increases for the planet within 1.5 degrees centigrade this century. To do that, you need to achieve carbon neutrality for the planet by 2050. And to do that, you need to radically increase everyone's nationally determined contributions for carbon reductions by 2030. That's why other countries have been doing that, and why Australia continues to sit on its hands on this defies my imagination and frankly is contrary to our basic economic and environmental interests.
Is Scott Morrison right, though, to point out that many of the countries making ambitious pledges to cut emissions haven't actually achieved any significant reduction to date?
Oh, Mr. Morrison will use any argument that comes into his mind. But the bottom line is, if you look at the trend line since we began these protracted global negotiations on climate change back in the Kyoto period and then through Copenhagen, Paris and to the present, you do see accelerated national and global ambition, and you do see trend lines heading towards peaking of carbon during the 2020s by many major economies around the world. As well as renewed commitments, of course, towards carbon neutrality by mid-century. Many countries will fall short. Others, however, are demonstrating that they can actually exceed their commitments. The bottom line is, unless you drive these measures, be they technology-based or be they market-based or a combination of carbon market-based or a combination of both, towards a mathematical target driven by the science, then they simply won't happen. Because we set targets, guess what? Renewable energies have taken off. Renewable energies within countries where they were just a boutique industry in the past have taken off. And other technologies have been fueled and fired as a result, and venture capitalists are now investing, all because governments are setting targets. It hasn't just materialised out of space. So Mr. Morrison is simply playing with political language there to try and provide himself with some camouflage for the inertia of his own government's position on this.
Look, it's been widely reported that he's clearly making his way towards committing to net zero emissions by 2050. He's made several comments now to suggest that the government, is working in that direction. What's your analysis about where the government's moving on that? Are they moving to that target? Is that how you read this?
Well, Patricia, there are two big targets which are relevant here. One which every other major economy in the world has now committed to virtually, and that is carbon neutrality by mid-century. The Americans have done it, the Japanese have done it, the South Koreans have done it, the Europeans have done it, and one by one they line up. Even on most recent reporting, the Brazilians have done it. but not Australia. So what we see is Morrison, in cahoots with his Murdoch puppet masters, inelegantly crab-walking their way towards accepting a position of mid-century carbon neutrality because there's no one else left with them standing. The second, however, target, which is much more materially relevant than the first, is where we currently stand in terms of our carbon reduction target for the 2030s. At present, it's that we have committed to a reduction target of between 26 and 28% of carbon emissions based on a 2005 level by 2030. Frankly, everyone else has now upped that to around about 50%. But Morrison refuses to embrace that. That's the number, the new what we call nationally determined contribution, which we need to have a razor-sharp focus on in the unfolding months between now and the Glasgow Conference of the Parties this November.
How seriously should China's pledge to significantly reduce emissions be taken, given emissions there are rising and there's no detailed plan on how they plan to reduce them?
Look, the honest answer to the China question, Patricia, is that it's a mixed bag. Certainly when I dealt with the Chinese in Copenhagen in 2009, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But from about 2014, you see a fundamental change in the Chinese public policy position, driven by their own analysis of how the science and the maths affects their national economy and national environmental prospects, which is where you start to see the big sea change in their own position. So therefore, since about that time, you begin to see Chinese domestic action on carbon reduction, the initiation of their emissions trading scheme within the last 12 months, and decisions certainly in calendar years 2018 and 2019 to reduce their construction of coal-fired power stations, but to be fair, a return to that construction in 2020 and so far this year as well, leaving aside some of the construction they're doing offshore through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a mixed bag, but the trend line, as reflected in the documents of the 14th five-year plan, continue to be infinitely more positive than they were when I began this process in negotiating with the Chinese in 2009.
Does this mean we should get ready for a more significant reduction in the amount of Australian coal China buys?
Look, if you are being a rational planner for the Australian coal industry, or more broadly hydrocarbons, there are big trends underway, Patricia, which so much of the country seems to have its head buried in the sand on right now. One is the global debate on hydrocarbons, in particular coal, where frankly you will not find today any mainstream financial institution willing to provide lines of capital to invest in a new coal-fired power station. It's only a couple of sovereign governments around the world that are doing that. So that's warning sign number one. Warning sign number two is China's own national plans to mothball its coal-fired power stations over time, use them as a reserve capability for the rest of their, as it were, fleet of power generators, which will increasingly become a renewable fleet. And so if you are looking at the trajectory for Australia's coal exports purely from a market analysis, leaving aside domestic climate change action in this country, it's all trend lining negative. And over time, similarly with gas as well. There must be, therefore, a fundamental readjustment of Australia's posture on coal. The days of Morrison walking into the Parliament with a lump of coal, saying this was his come-to-Jesus moment for the Australian resources industry, frankly, as an appeal to past nostalgia rather than the future reality dictated by markets abroad.
Just moving on to another topic that's been big this week, was the federal government right to tear up Victoria's Belt and Road MOU, given it was largely symbolic?
Oh, look, it's just a piece of marginal politics, to be quite honest, Patricia. If you look at the MOU, it says in its own language it's not legally binding. And furthermore, there are no projects yet to be concretely identified, let alone financed. So when I look at this action by the Morrison government in the last 24 hours, backed up with the hairy-chested language always from Peter Dutton, now the Defence Minister today, this is primarily just about a political agenda shift within the country. In Australia, we know that this government, the Morrison government, has been doing badly on climate change, badly on its vaccination rollout, and badly in terms of the sexual abuse scandals in Canberra. And as a consequence, it finds itself in all sorts of political trouble. So what we've seen in the last week is a desperate attempt to redefine the political agenda around the grounds of the economy leading into the budget, and now around national security, around China, and giving the Chinese a good old whack on the way through so that people like Dutton and Morrison can look hairy-chested in the eyes of voters. The substance of it doesn't really add up to that.
Yeah, but China is promising now a firm and forceful response. Should we expect and anticipate that kind of response, or is this just a big threat? Are we going to see more economic retaliation?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. If you speak to exporters around the country, the impact in a number of industries is already being felt, wine being one of them. What now happens in the future, I don't know. But my fundamental concern here, Patricia, is that there are so many things in the Australia-China relationship which are problematic, where we will have real foreign policy and international economic policy disagreements with the Chinese on. Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, human rights, etc. But for the Morrison government simply to reach into its Bicky tin and pull out something called let's ban the Victorian state government MOU with the Chinese on the BRI to poke a stick in the eyeballs of the Chinese and expect to get some sort of service medal pinned on their chest like some sort of Colonel Blimp on parade is not only foolish, it's hypocritical given the fact that when Victoria signed the MOU in the first place, Birmingham, then the Trade Minister, welcomed it with open arms. And on top of it, on real infrastructure questions, you had this extraordinary act of hypocrisy with the Morrison government having green-lighted the Chinese actual leasing for 99 years of our strategically important Port of Darwin in the Northern Territory. None of it makes public policy sense. It's all about political repositioning in a government which is under domestic political challenge.
Just finally, is the government right to be restricting travel to and from India, given the surging cases there?
Look, I have complete sympathy and empathy for the people of India and the horrors they are going through at present. 300,000 plus cases a day with an overwhelmed public health system. I've been in contact in the last 24 hours with friends of mine who are members of the Indian government and members of the Indian Parliament. This is a horrendous crisis for our dear friends in Delhi and across the subcontinent. On the question of the public health advice to the Australian federal and state governments, look, it's wrong for politicians to get in the road of that. Whatever the public health advice is to our authorities, we should adhere to it with proper due caution. But we need to be extending the hand of solidarity to our friends in Delhi at the moment who are going through the 7 stages of hell at the moment as far as this virus is concerned.
Yeah, it's very sad scenes coming out of India, that's for sure. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Good to be with you, Patricia.